report.
Moderate Syrian rebels are reduced to training with wooden replica guns. They say they simply can't resist the heavy weaponry of the Syrian army unless they get more help from outside. So are these the people we might start supplying with arms? Islamists, yes, but not Al-Qaeda. It's so hard to know when one man's rebel becomes another man's jihadist, or where the weapons might end up. Fears of a foreign-fed arms race in Syria increased today as Russia announced that they will be sending state-of-the-art anti-aircraft missiles to the Assad regime, while at the same time criticising the EU for lifting their arms embargo.
You cannot on one hand declare your intention to stop the bloodshed, but on the other hand move in the direction of pumping Syria with yet more weapons.
The lifting of the embargo is the latest development in Syria's increasingly international civil war. Britain and France are now free to join Qatar and Saudi Arabia, who are already thought to have provided weaponry to opposition factions. Russia's continuing supply of arms makes them one of the regime's biggest supporters. And then there's Assad's regional allies. Lebanese militant group Hezbollah has fighters on the ground, and Iran is strongly suspected of providing tons of weapons. The UK could start arming Syrian rebels tomorrow if they wanted to, but the Foreign Secretary made very clear today they've got no intention of doing so before August at the very earliest. There certainly will not be any armed shipments before a peace conference that it is hoped will take place next month. And that conference is what this move is really all about. It's more of a diplomatic development than a military one at this stage. The idea is that lifting the EU arms embargo should put more pressure on President Assad to negotiate a settlement, or he faces the possibility of the UK and France arming his enemies. The US and Russian foreign ministers hope to convene a peace conference in Geneva in just 2 weeks' time. The Russians believe promises to arm the rebels will directly harm those negotiations. William Hague is convinced it will pressure Assad into making concessions.
Having met President Assad several times, I'm not sure that that's the case. I don't think this is one of the things that he's going to take into this. What he will be concerned about is the big guys, namely the United States and Russia, and where they are. Can he fully count on Russia to back him all the way? And will the United States position change on this?
The US do not currently plan to start arming Syrian rebels. The dangers are obvious. The moderate rebels whom the West wants to win fight alongside Al-Qaeda affiliates who would happily turn our own guns against us one day.
Sarah Smith, well, we're joined now in the studio by the Syrian writer and filmmaker Hala Diab, who opposes the arming of rebels, and from Brussels by the senior Liberal Democrat MP Edward Macmillan-Scott, who is Vice President of the European Parliament. Edward Macmillan-Scott, what persuades you that with over 1,000 factions on the battlefield, some of them very strongly allied to Al-Qaeda, that any weapons sent by Britain or France will not in the end up in their hands?
There are two key elements here. One is that the fighting has been going on now for more than 2 years. More than 80,000 people have died. There's a humanitarian crisis raging across the region. And secondly, I'm convinced that the British and the French are taking the right approach, because in the same way that those two countries, and we're now joined incidentally by the United States, the State Department has been speaking very recently and endorsing the French and UK decision to make the provision for supplying weapons to the Free Syrian Army, and on the basis that this is a capacity we now have. You're right to say it's primarily diplomatic. There is no immediate intention to do so, but the capacity to do so will exist from Saturday onwards.
Well, with respect, William Hague has said today we do intend to do so, and we needn't necessarily wait even until August to do so.
Well, precisely, I'm saying from Saturday onwards, the EU embargo had to be replaced by a new embargo which takes effect from June the 1st. And that not only maintains the existing sanctions on the Syrian regime, but also allows individual countries like France and the United Kingdom, and others if they wish to supply military equipment and other equipment to the opposition to Assad. So I think there is a fundamental change in this, and as I say, just within the last few minutes, the State Department has actually endorsed the French and UK position.
Well, however, they make it quite clear they're not going to arm them themselves at the moment.
Well, that remains to be seen. I was in Washington recently, and certainly there's a very great restraint on the part of the Obama administration about any deep involvement. On the other hand, the visit of John McCain to Syria on Monday and the instincts on Washington's Capitol Hill that terrible things have been happening in Syria, that there is a power game in play involving other countries around the region and, of course, Russia.
Let me bring in Hala Diab. What's your reason for opposing weapons to the rebels?
I just want to answer what he said when he said this lifting the embargo will stop the conflict in Syria. It will not stop the conflict in Syria. That will widen the circle of violence, because now the opposition will know that they have support from the West in order to be armed, and there will be a race of arms between the opposition and between the government, between the regime. And what is actually the guarantee that these arms will not fall in the hands of the extreme rebels, in the hands of Jabhat al-Nusra, in the hands of Al-Qaeda? There is a very thin line defining moderate Muslims and extreme Muslims. And actually there was warning from the Home Office, I mean, last week, about the fear the West and Europe and England have from the British and the European convert and Muslims fighters who go to Syria, who join the rebels there, and then come back to Europe and carry extreme attacks. We know very well that we can't trust extreme Muslims. We can't trust any person who fights on the basis of Islamic ideologies.
Right.
And rebels in Syria are fighting on the Islamic ideology, not because they want to bring democracy to Syria.
Well, your reaction to that, there is some truth, is there not, that there are people motivated by jihadist issues far more than they are about the wider Syrian issue.
Of course, I mean, it's a very complicated issue. I mean, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is closely allied to Al-Qaeda, the Hezbollah fighters, there are 15,000 of them now, siding with Assad. You know, it is a complex situation, but I'm satisfied that what are called rebel-held areas of the country do largely are peopled by people who are not extremists, but just fighting for their survival.
But these are wonderfully vague terms. The word largely is a wonderfully expandable word. I mean, the fact is that from our own reporters who've been in the field, the thing is a complete shambles. There are jihadists penetrating virtually every element of the rebel areas. And the fact is, what are you going to do in a year's time if some of your constituents are killed by a missile that we supplied?
It's always a dilemma, but in this situation where there's not only a humanitarian situation but a most brutal repression of his own people by Assad, it's been going on now for several years, but most particularly the last 2 years. This has to be brought to a stop.
You arm it with weapons which could be turned on your own people.
I've met many people from the Syrian opposition, the respectable opposition, if you'd like to call it that, the non-extremist opposition. They are absolutely desperate for support, not just weapons, but also other support. The EU has been the largest supplier of aid.
Syrian opposition who have not been elected by the Syrian people. Who had elected the Syrian opposition? No.
Okay, nor has President Assad.
Okay, so they are like Assad. Actually, they have been handpicked by the West or by Qatar and Saudi Arabia. They don't represent Syrians. We have not elected the oppositions, who half of them are Islamists, or the military council, which half of them are fighting on the basis of jihad and for Jabhat al-Nusra slogans, which have been actually spread over all the territories which are under the control of rebels. Why are we denying that the Raqqa is under the control of Jabhat al-Nusra? Why are we denying that Aleppo, we have a Sharia council in Aleppo? Why are we denying that?
A final word, Edward Williams-Scott.
I think it's time for calm reflection on a decision taken by the British government and the French government and the European Union as a whole to maintain the sanctions on Assad's regime and at the same time to allow countries like France and Britain, which, as in the case of Libya, intend to go forward as pioneers and do what they can to dislodge a regime which is frankly disgraceful and should have been ended years ago.
Edward Williams-Scott and Hala Diab, thank you both very much indeed. Christian.
Thanks, John. Well, from Syria to the